I was hiking alone in the Cascade Mountains, deep in the wilderness where the trails thinned out and cell service was long gone. I had planned the trip for months, poring over maps, watching weather reports, and packing all the essentials. I wasn't new to this. Solo hiking had become my escape from the noise of life. There was something about the quiet, the endless trees, the fresh mountain air that kept me coming back. But this time, something felt off, even from the beginning. The first day was uneventful. I started my hike early, feeling strong, my pack sitting comfortably on my shoulders. The trail wound through dense evergreens, sunlight filtering through the canopy, dappling the ground in patches of gold. Birds chirped, a stream gurgled somewhere off to my right, and I settled into a steady rhythm. By noon, I had covered a good distance and took a short break on a flat rock overlooking a valley. That's when I first noticed it. Something subtle, something easy to ignore, a faint rustling in the trees, too steady to be the wind. I turned, scanning the forest, but saw nothing, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I chalked it up to an animal and moved on. As the afternoon wore on, I reached a fork in the trail. One path led up toward the ridgeline, the other dipped into a valley. I chose the ridgeline, knowing the views would be worth it. The climb was tough, my legs burning as I ascended. The air grew cooler and the wind picked up. By late afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing near a cluster of boulders, with a breathtaking view of the mountains in the distance. As I unpacked my tent, that same rustling sound returned. This time it was closer. I stood still, listening. It was distinct now, slow, deliberate steps moving just beyond the tree line. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe an elk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. Night fell quickly in the mountains. I ate a quick meal, the sky shifting from deep blue to inky black. The stars were brilliant, the kind of display you only see far from civilization. But I couldn't enjoy it. My nerves were on edge. The sounds in the trees had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay there, listening. The wind howled through the trees, but underneath it, I swore I heard something else. Something moving just beyond my camp. Then, a distinct crunch of leaves. Someone was out there. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps circled my tent, slow, careful. Not an animal, not a bear, person. I reached for my knife, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to call out, to scare them off, but fear kept me silent. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, I packed up and left, moving fast, my head on a swivel. I took a different route back, avoiding the ridge, cutting through a narrow valley instead. The whole time I felt watched. The trees pressed in, the silence unnatural. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, too fresh, and not mine. They led off the trail, disappearing into the trees. My stomach twisted. Someone had been following me. Maybe they still were. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My map showed a service road a few miles ahead. If I could reach it, I could follow it down to the highway. Then something caught my eye. A small, weathered campsite just off the trail. No tent, just a few scattered belongings. An old backpack, some torn fabric, rusted cooking supplies. And in the dirt, more footprints leading away. I didn't stop, couldn't. For hours, I hiked nonstop, my legs screaming, lungs burning. I reached the service road just as the sun began to set, the sky bleeding orange and red. I didn't feel safe until I heard the distant hum of a car engine. When I finally made it back to my truck, parked at the trailhead, I locked the doors and just sat there, catching my breath. My hands were shaking. The next day, I reported what I saw to the rangers. They listened, nodded, took notes. Then one of them, an older guy with weathered skin and tired eyes, said something that chilled me. We get reports like this every now and then. Campers going missing, footprints where they shouldn't be. Sometimes we find abandoned camps like the one you saw. Sometimes we don't. I asked if they ever found out who was out there. He just shook his head. Not usually. I never went back to that trail, and I never hiked alone again. I never thought a solo hike would turn into the worst experience of my life. I had always been an outdoors person, spending weekends exploring trails and pushing myself further each time. There was something about being alone in nature that made me feel at peace. But looking back, I was naive. The wilderness doesn't care about your confidence. It doesn't care if you think you know what you're doing. It doesn't care about you at all. This hike was supposed to be a challenge. A long, difficult trail winding through dense forest, climbing up rugged hills, and following an old, barely maintained path that most people avoided. I had read about it online. Some described it as beautiful and peaceful, while others warned about how easy it was to get lost. But I had experience. I had gear. I had studied the maps and prepared for the worst, or so I thought. I set out early, the morning air crisp and cool. My pack was heavy with supplies, enough food for a couple of days, a tent, a sleeping bag, a GPS, a paper map as a backup, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't planning on spending the night, but I liked to be prepared. My phone had no signal out here, but that was expected. That was part of the appeal. No distractions, no noise, just me and the trail. The first few hours were perfect. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. Birds called to each other in the canopy above. The trail was rough but manageable, winding through towering trees and crossing small streams. I felt good, strong, confident. Then, about 6 miles in, things started to change. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker. The path became harder to follow, overgrown in places, forcing me to slow down. I checked my GPS, still on track, but something felt off. The air was different, heavy. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook it off and pressed on, following the trail as best as I could. An hour later, I reached a small clearing where I planned to rest. There was an old fire pit in the center, long abandoned. Someone had been here before, but not recently. I sat down, drank some water, and ate a protein bar. That's when I noticed the first sign of trouble. A boot print in the dirt. Fresh, not mine. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Maybe another hiker had passed through earlier that morning. It was possible, but unlikely. This trail wasn't popular. Still, I told myself it was nothing. I finished my break and kept moving. The trail became even worse after that. The trees seemed closer together, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like fingers reaching for my ankles. I had to watch my step constantly. The further I went, the less the path resembled a trail at all. It felt more like I was forcing my way through untouched wilderness. But my GPS still showed I was heading in the right direction. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. A torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Dark blue. It looked like part of a jacket. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. The edges were frayed, but it wasn't old. It hadn't been there long. I didn't like that, not one bit. Something inside me whispered that I should turn back, but I had come too far to quit now. The map showed that the trail looped around a ridge before heading back toward the start. If I turned around, I'd have to retrace miles of difficult terrain. If I kept going, I'd be back at my car before nightfall. I made the wrong choice. As I pushed forward, the terrain got worse. The ground sloped upward, and I had to use my hands to steady myself on loose dirt and rocks. My breathing grew heavy. Sweat dripped down my back. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I stopped, listened. My pulse pounded in my ears. Nothing. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, long and shifting in the dimming light. I saw no movement, no sign of anything unusual, but I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I forced myself to keep going, my pace quicker, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked my GPS again. It had lost signal. That wasn't supposed to happen. It had worked fine earlier. I pulled out my paper map, but I had no idea where I was anymore. The trail was gone. Panic crept in, but I pushed it down. I had to keep moving. Then, up ahead, something caught my eye. A structure. It was small and partially hidden among the trees. An old wooden shelter, maybe, or the remains of a hunting cabin. The roof sagged, the walls were covered in moss, and the door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated. Going inside was the last thing I wanted to do. But night was coming fast, and I had lost the trail. I needed to get my bearings, check my map properly, maybe even wait until morning. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. A rusted lantern sat on a broken table. The place had been abandoned for years. Then I saw the footprints in the dust. Not mine. Someone had been here, recently. A sharp, cold fear settled in my stomach. I backed toward the door, every nerve in my body screaming to get out. That's when I heard the breathing. Slow, heavy, right behind me. I ran. I don't remember how I got out of that forest. I don't remember how long I ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches slashing at my arms, lungs burning. I just ran. Somehow I found the trail again. Somehow I made it back to my car. I don't even remember unlocking the door, just slamming it behind me and peeling out of that empty parking lot, gravel spraying behind my tires. I never went back. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that breathing. I had planned this hike for months. The route was a long, rugged trail cutting through deep forests and winding up into the mountains. It was supposed to take 3 days, covering nearly 30 miles of wilderness. I had done similar hikes before, but this one was different. It was remote. No designated campsites, no cell service, and no quick way out if something went wrong. That was the appeal, though complete isolation. I packed everything I needed. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, enough food for 5 days just in case, and a GPS device that worked via satellite. My backpack was heavy, but I had trained for this. I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The first day went smoothly. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The trail was well-defined, winding through dense trees and occasionally opening up to views of the valley below. I made good time, covering nearly 12 miles before setting up camp beside a small stream. I ate a quick meal, stretched my sore legs, and crawled into my sleeping bag as the sun dipped below the trees. I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise, a snapping twig. Not unusual in the woods. Animals move around constantly, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the quick rustle of a small creature. It was slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind pushing through the trees. I told myself it was nothing and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and moved on, shaking off the unease from the night before. The trail grew steeper, and the forest thickened. The further I went, the more untouched it felt. By late afternoon, I reached a high ridge and paused to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something strange. Off the trail, maybe 50 yards into the trees, there was a clearing. A small, unnatural-looking clearing. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped off the trail to take a closer look. As I neared, I saw the ground was bare. No grass, no leaves, just exposed dirt. And in the center, there were deep scratches in the soil. Not animal tracks, not claw marks, but long, straight gouges, like someone had dragged something heavy through it. My stomach tightened. It didn't look like a place people camped. It looked like a place where something had been buried or dug up. I turned and walked back to the trail, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch sent a chill up my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I set up camp earlier than planned. I found a relatively open spot, not wanting to be too close to the thick trees. I made a small fire, ate, and tried to relax. The unease from earlier lingered, but nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. Then I woke up again. This time I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps circling my tent. My heart pounded. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my hand. I listened. The steps stopped. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, just as I started to convince myself it was an animal, I heard something worse. Breathing. Not heavy, not exaggerated, just soft, slow breathing right outside my tent. I stayed completely still. My brain screamed at me to do something, to get up, to make noise, to scare whatever it was away. But I couldn't move. I just lay there, heart hammering, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting at any second to see a shadow move against it. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, gripping my knife, waiting for morning. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, I packed my gear and left. I abandoned my planned route. I just wanted to get out. The problem was I had hiked deep into the mountains, and the fastest way out was forward. So I kept going, moving as fast as I could without running. Midday, I saw something else that made my stomach drop. Boot prints. Fresh ones. Not mine. Not from a hiker. They were too wide, too deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. And they weren't following the trail. They came from the woods, crossed over the path, and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't stop to think. I just kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the final stretch of the trail, a long descent leading to a small parking area where my car was waiting. Relief flooded me. I picked up the pace. I was almost out, almost safe. Then, just as I neared the last bend, I noticed something. A man, standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I just walked as fast as I could, forcing myself not to break into a run. My car was just ahead. I could see it. As I reached for my keys, I glanced back. He was gone. I didn't waste a second. I threw my pack in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I forced myself not to look in the rearview mirror. I just drove. I never went back to that trail. I never reported it. I don't know what I saw, what I heard, or what would have happened if I had stayed another night. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I parked my truck at the base of the mountain. It was early, too early for most people to be out here, and that was exactly why I chose this time. I liked hiking alone. No distractions, no conversations, just me, the trail, and the quiet. I had been planning this trip for weeks. The trail wasn't well known, which made it perfect. I wanted isolation, something raw and untouched. A friend had mentioned it once, saying he had heard about it from some old-timer at a gas station. No official maps listed it, but I had scoured satellite images and pieced together a route. The hike wasn't supposed to be easy, but I liked a challenge. I strapped on my backpack, double-checked my supplies, water, snacks, first aid, knife, emergency whistle, GPS, and my phone with an external battery. The service was non-existent up here, but I had downloaded offline maps. Everything was set. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The trail was overgrown but manageable. Birds chirped in the trees, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. I felt good. The incline started to get steeper, but I welcomed the burn in my legs. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. A single boot, half buried in the dirt beside the trail. It was old and weathered, the leather cracked and peeling. The laces were missing, and inside, I could see what looked like animal droppings. It had been here for a while. I nudged it with my boot before moving on, chalking it up to some careless hunter losing their gear. An hour later, I found the second one. It wasn't another boot this time. It was a backpack, torn open, its contents scattered. A jacket, a crushed water bottle, some granola bar wrappers. I knelt down, examining it. The fabric had been ripped apart, not just from age, but violently, as if something had clawed or chewed through it. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I wasn't the first person to come through here. Someone else had, and they had left in a hurry. I checked the area, scanning the trees and underbrush. Nothing. No sounds beyond the usual forest noises. I kept going. The higher I climbed, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of everything. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind whistling through the trees. Then I smelled it, something rotten, thick and cloying. It wasn't the usual decay of a dead animal. It was worse, stronger, the kind that made your stomach churn. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and kept walking. And then I saw it, a tent or what was left of one. The fabric was shredded, the poles snapped like twigs. Clothes and camping gear were strewn everywhere, mixed with dirt and leaves. There was no sign of anyone. I crouched down, examining the wreckage. A sleeping bag lay partially unzipped, dirt and twigs clinging to the fabric. I nudged it open with the end of a stick, my heart pounding. No one inside, but there was something else. Deep gouges in the ground, leading away from the campsite, like something had been dragged. My gut told me to turn back, but I was stubborn. Maybe someone got hurt, an animal attack, something explainable. Maybe they needed help. I followed the marks. They led into the trees, weaving through the underbrush. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got. Flies buzzed in the thick, stagnant air. Then I saw the first bone. It was small, too small to be human. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. It was clean, stripped of all flesh. Nearby, another, then another. The trail ended at a small clearing. Pile of bones. Not just animals. My breath caught in my throat. There were human bones among them. Some bleached white, others still bearing shreds of flesh. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all piled together like discarded leftovers. I turned and ran. I don't know how far I got before I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, somewhere between a growl and a breath. I didn't look back. Couldn't. My only thought was getting out. The trail blurred past me, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning. I stumbled, catching myself on a tree. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then the smell again, stronger this time. I risked a glance over my shoulder. Something moved in the trees. Not an animal, not a person, something else. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I don't even remember unlocking the door, just that I was inside, slamming it shut, locking it, my chest heaving. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped them. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Later that night, when I finally calmed down, I tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was a wild animal, a bear, or a mountain lion. Maybe I let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe the bones were from old hunting kills, the wrecked campsite just some unlucky hiker who got lost. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in those woods, and I was never going back. I had been planning the solo hike for months. It was something I'd always wanted to do. Disconnect from everything, get away from people, and just lose myself in the wilderness for a few days. I picked a remote trail deep in the mountains, one that wasn't too popular but still had enough markers to keep me from getting completely lost. I packed carefully, enough food for 4 days, a sturdy tent, extra clothes, a map, and a satellite phone just in case. Everything was set. The first day went as expected. I followed the marked trail, winding up through thick forests, the smell of damp earth filling my nose. The air was cool, and the silence was thick, only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It felt good to be out there alone, away from everything. No traffic, no talking, no distractions. Just me and nature. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small stream and decided to set up camp. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. I built a small fire, ate one of my packed meals, and watched the sky darken. The stars came out bright, and I sat there for a while, just taking it all in. That night, I slept fine, only waking up a couple of times to the sound of distant animals moving through the brush. Nothing unusual. The second day, I moved deeper into the trail. It was steeper here, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. The trees grew closer together, and the farther I went, the quieter everything became. Even the birds seemed less active. Around midday, I stopped to rest near a ridge, drinking water and checking the map. I was still on the right path, though I noticed the markers were becoming less frequent. It wasn't concerning yet, but I made a mental note to be more cautious. A few hours later, things started to feel off. At first, it was just a feeling, like the woods had suddenly grown heavier around me. The silence was thicker, like the air itself was pressing in. I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I kept hiking, the feeling didn't go away. I noticed something strange about the trees. Some of them had deep gouges in the bark, like something had been scraping against them. Not claw marks, something larger, almost like a tool had hacked into them. The cuts were old, darkened with age, but they were everywhere. I didn't remember reading anything about logging in this area. Then, I found the first thing that made my stomach tighten. A torn piece of fabric, tangled in a bush just off the trail. It was faded and weathered, but it looked like it had once been part of a jacket or a backpack. Someone had been through here before. I figured it could have been from another hiker, maybe someone who had passed through years ago. But then I found more. A few yards ahead, another piece of fabric, this one caught on a low-hanging branch. Then a rusted-out canteen, half buried in the dirt. A single hiking boot, the sole nearly falling off. It wasn't just random trash. This was someone's gear, and it was old. I felt a tightness in my chest. I wasn't alone out here, not in the way I had expected. Someone had been here before, and they had left in a hurry. I decided to keep going. Turning back now didn't seem necessary, and I still had plenty of daylight left. I told myself it was probably just lost gear from hikers who had gotten careless. People drop things all the time, right? The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. The ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and loose rocks. The wind had picked up slightly, sending a low whistle through the trees. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A backpack. It was sitting in the middle of the trail, half covered in dirt and leaves. It had been there for a long time. The fabric was torn, the zippers rusted. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. It was open, and inside there was still food. Old, rotting, covered in mold, but still recognizable. No one leaves their food behind in the wilderness unless they're planning on coming back. Except no one had. I took a slow step forward, my heart pounding. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The forest was still too still. I crouched down and poked through the bag carefully. There were clothes, faded and damp, and a small notebook, its pages ruined by moisture. I flipped through it, but the ink had bled too much to make out any words. The only thing I could read was a date on the inside cover, 1997. This bag had been sitting here for over 20 years. I stood up fast, my breath shallow. That tight feeling in my chest had turned into full-blown panic. Someone had been out here and they had never made it back. I turned to head back the way I came, screw finishing the hike. I wasn't about to become the next missing person in these woods. That's when I heard it, a branch snapping, not behind me, ahead. I froze. The sound had come from somewhere just beyond the trees off the trail. I scanned the area, my pulse hammering. I couldn't see anything. Then another sound, closer this time, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I wasn't alone. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I turned and started walking fast, my mind racing. I didn't run, not yet. Running could lead to a twisted ankle, a fall. I needed to stay focused. But then the sounds behind me grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, uneven, like someone was following me, but trying not to be heard. I broke into a full sprint. I don't know how long I ran. The trail blurred past me, my breath burning in my chest. I ignored the sharp branches cutting into my arms, the pain in my legs. I just ran. Eventually, I saw it, the clearing where I had camped the night before. My tent was still there, my pack, everything. I grabbed my gear, heart pounding, and didn't stop moving. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, not stopping until I was back at my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove until I was miles away from that place. I never went back. Later, I did some digging. That trail had a history of disappearances, dating back decades. People who had gone in and never come out. No one ever found their bodies, just their gear, left behind like they had vanished into thin air. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to find out. I had been planning this hike for weeks, a solo trip into the mountains, away from the constant noise of the city, away from people. I wanted silence, fresh air, and the feeling of being completely alone with nature. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, nothing too intense, just 2 days of hiking and a night camping in the wilderness before heading back to my car. I arrived early in the morning, my backpack stuffed with supplies. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear. It was the kind of weather that made you feel lucky to be outside. The trail I had chosen was an old one, not the kind of well-maintained paths that families and casual hikers used. This one was isolated, rugged, and barely marked. That's why I picked it. I wanted to be alone. The first few hours were perfect. The sound of birds, the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I had that satisfying feeling of my muscles working, my breath steady. I wasn't thinking about work, about emails, about anything. Just me and the trail. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock overlooking a valley and sat down, pulling out a sandwich from my pack. The view was incredible. Rolling hills, dense trees, and in the distance, the faint shimmer of a river. There was no one around. I hadn't seen another person since I left my car. It was exactly what I wanted. I was careful to pack up my trash, making sure I left no sign I had been there. I had another 5 or 6 miles to cover before I reached the spot where I planned to camp for the night. I strapped my pack back on and continued down the trail. That's when I first noticed something was off. I wasn't sure what it was at first, just a feeling, a slight unease. The forest was still a little too still. No birds, no rustling, just my own footsteps. It's strange how quickly silence can become unsettling when you're alone in the wilderness. I tried to shake it off. Sometimes the woods just get quiet. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a fox or a coyote. I kept walking. Another hour passed. The feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not sure why. I hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then I saw it. A footprint. It was on the trail, clear as day, and it wasn't mine. It was fresh. The dirt was still soft around the edges, undisturbed by wind or time. I stopped, staring at it. I had been hiking for hours and hadn't seen a single person. This trail wasn't popular, and there were no other cars parked at the trailhead when I arrived. So where did this footprint come from? I swallowed, my mouth dry. Maybe someone else had taken a different route up here. Maybe they had come and gone earlier in the day. But if that were the case, why did the footprint look so fresh? I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was still quiet, too quiet. My skin prickled. I took a slow breath and kept moving, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. Another mile passed, and I found another footprint. This time, it was off the trail, just barely visible in the underbrush. It was like someone had stepped away from the path and into the trees, and they had been barefoot. My stomach tightened. I bent down, examining the print closely. The toes, the arch, it was definitely a human footprint. But who the hell was walking barefoot out here, miles from civilization? I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees around me seemed taller, darker. I scanned the forest, looking for movement. Nothing, just endless trees and shadows. I picked up my pace. Another mile. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trail. I needed to find a place to camp soon. I had planned to reach a small clearing near a stream, but now I wasn't sure I wanted to stop at all. My instincts were screaming at me to turn around, to go back. But that would mean hiking in the dark, and that was even more dangerous. I kept moving. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. Not behind me, ahead. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I scanned the trail, the trees. Nothing, but someone was there. I knew it. The sound hadn't come from an animal. It was deliberate, controlled. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound was gone. The forest was silent again. My skin crawled. I needed to get out of there. I turned and started walking back the way I came, faster this time. I no longer cared about finishing the hike. I just wanted to reach my car. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now, like invisible eyes pressing against my back. Every few steps, I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, standing in the trees, the footprints, the silence, the snapping branch. I had been followed, and then, in the dim light, I saw it, a figure, half hidden behind a tree, just off the trail, barefoot, standing completely still, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, my backpack bouncing against my back. I didn't care. I sprinted down the trail, my lungs burning, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs screamed and the world blurred around me. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting untouched, I nearly sobbed. I fumbled with my keys, threw my pack in the back, and tore out of there so fast my tires kicked up gravel. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never hike alone again. I had always loved hiking. There was something about being out in the wild, surrounded by towering trees, endless trails, and the quiet hum of nature that made me feel alive. The solitude, the challenge. It was the perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. This time, I had picked a trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't a well-known spot, just a long, winding path leading into the dense forest. I had found it on an old map in a used bookstore. No online reviews, no GPS markers, just a thin, dotted line cutting through a blank stretch of wilderness. That was exactly what I wanted. Something untouched, something real. I started early in the morning, my pack loaded with supplies. I had my tent, enough food for 3 days, a good knife, and all the gear I needed. The plan was simple: follow the trail as far as I could, set up camp, and head back the next day. I was prepared for anything, or at least I thought I was. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, the sun warm but not too hot. The path was narrow but well-trodden, winding through towering pines. Every so often, I would stop to listen to the sounds of the forest, birds calling, the distant rustle of a deer moving through the underbrush. Felt peaceful. But around noon, things started to change. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was subtle at first. The usual sounds of the forest, the birds, the wind in the trees, began to fade. At first, I figured it was just the change in elevation, maybe the density of the trees muffling the noise. But after another half hour, I realized it wasn't just quieter. It was dead silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant hum of insects. I stopped and looked around. The trees were thicker here, taller. The sunlight barely reached the ground, casting long shadows that seemed darker than they should be. I shook it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking. An hour later, I found something strange. The trail, which had been clear and steady, suddenly split into two. That didn't make sense. The map I had showed only one trail, a single line stretching through the forest. But here it was, an unmistakable fork. One path looked like the one I had been following, narrow, winding, cutting through the trees. The other was different. It was wider, smoother, as if it had been cleared recently. But there were no signs of human activity. No footprints, no tire tracks. Just a clean, almost unnatural-looking path leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated. I should have turned back right then. But I didn't. Curiosity got the better of me, and I took the new path. At first, it felt normal, easier even. The ground was level, the trees evenly spaced. I moved faster, thinking maybe this was an old maintenance trail. But then I saw something that made me stop cold. A single boot, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't old. The leather was worn but intact, the laces still looped through the eyelets. Someone had lost it recently, but there were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here. I bent down to look closer, and that's when I saw it. The boot had been cut. Not torn, not weathered, cut cleanly, straight down the middle, like something sharp had sliced right through it. My stomach tightened. I straightened up and looked around. The trees seemed taller now, their trunks stretching impossibly high. The silence was suffocating. I turned back the way I came. The path was gone. I spun in a circle. The wide, smooth trail I had been following had disappeared. In its place was untouched forest. No sign of a path, no break in the trees. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. Panic surged in my chest. I knew better than to run. I took a deep breath, forced myself to think. I still had my compass, my map. If I could just get my bearings. Then I saw something move, a shape deep in the trees, just a flicker of movement too fast to make out. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. I reached into my pack, gripping my knife. My heart was pounding, but I had to stay focused. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I started walking, not running, not panicking, just moving. I needed to find the original trail. I kept my steps quiet, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Then, ahead of me, I saw it. Clearing. A small, open space in the trees. Relief flooded through me. If I could get to the clearing, I could reorient myself, find my way back. I stepped forward and nearly fell. The ground beneath me sloped suddenly downward. Not a hill, not a dip, but a sharp, unnatural drop. I barely caught myself before tumbling in. It wasn't a pit. It was something else. A long, deep trench stretching into the trees. And at the bottom, I swallowed hard. Bones. Not animal bones. Not random, scattered remains. These were human. Skulls, ribs, femurs all piled together. Some were old, yellowed with age. Others, some were fresh. I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but my body felt frozen. Then, behind me, a twig snapped. I turned. A figure stood just beyond the trees. Tall, still, watching. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't care about the noise, about keeping calm. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, crashing through the trees, my pack slamming against my back. Branches tore at my skin. My lungs burned. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then, a break in the trees. A real one this time. I burst into the open and saw it, my car. I didn't question how. I just ran. I threw open the door, shoved the keys into the ignition, and peeled out onto the road. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I never found that trail again. I tried looking for it, but it was gone, like it had never existed. The map? Useless. The place wasn't on any record. I still don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know, but I know one thing for sure. Some places aren't meant to be found. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to test myself, push my limits, and disconnect from the world for a few days. The route I chose was deep in the wilderness, miles away from any towns or cell service. It was supposed to be challenging but rewarding, with stunning views and untouched nature. I parked my car at the trailhead, double-checked my gear, and set off. The first day was everything I had hoped for. Pure solitude, fresh air, and the sound of nothing but my boots crunching on the dirt. The trail was well marked, and I made good time. By sunset, I had set up camp near a small stream, cooked a simple meal, and sat by my fire, feeling satisfied. The second day was harder. The elevation gain was brutal, and the trail became rougher, less maintained. Thick tree roots jutted out of the ground, forcing me to watch my step. The silence felt heavier. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone, miles from civilization. Of course, it would feel eerie. By late afternoon, I reached an old, abandoned fire lookout tower. I had read about it in my research, a relic from the past, now just a decaying wooden structure with a rusted ladder leading up to the platform. I climbed up to take in the view. The endless stretch of forest, the jagged peaks in the distance, the fading sun casting long shadows. It was beautiful, but something about it also felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling and set up camp nearby. As I prepared for the night, I heard something, a low, distant sound, almost like a groan. I froze. It wasn't an animal noise. It wasn't the wind. It sounded human, but far away, carried through the trees. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Nothing, just silence again. I tried to tell myself it was the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was the structure of the lookout shifting in the breeze. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something moving outside my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Not heavy, but not light enough to be an animal. Every time I unzipped my tent to check, my flashlight beam revealed nothing but trees and darkness. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I packed up and got moving as quickly as possible. I felt better once I was back on the trail, but something gnawed at me, a feeling like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. The trail became rougher, barely a path at all. Bushes clawed at my legs, and fallen trees forced me to climb or go around. I checked my map and GPS frequently. This section of the trail was supposed to lead to an old service road, which would take me back to the main route. But I never found it. Instead, I found something else. At first, I thought it was just another abandoned campsite. But as I got closer, I realized how wrong I was. The tent was shredded, not collapsed, ripped apart. Gear was scattered, torn clothing half buried under leaves. A backpack lay open, its contents spilling out, but no food. No sign of an animal raid, just destruction. And no people. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever had been here had left, or something had made them leave. I looked around, scanning the trees, the ground, searching for any sign of where they went. Nothing. That's when I noticed the marks. Deep scratches in the trees. Not claw marks, something else. Something deliberate. I didn't want to be here anymore. I checked my GPS again. Still no sign of the service road. I was running low on water, and the sun was already dipping lower. I needed to find my way back to the main trail. I walked faster. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not mine. Somewhere behind me, steady, matching my pace. I turned so fast I nearly lost my footing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was stronger now, pressing down on me. I moved faster, almost jogging. The trees blurred past me. I wasn't thinking about exhaustion or the weight of my pack anymore. I just wanted to get out. Then I saw it. A second campsite, just like the first. Same destruction, same eerie silence. But this one was worse. There were no signs of people, just more shredded tents, broken gear, a fire pit, long cold. And the worst part, a notebook half buried in the dirt. I picked it up with shaking hands. The pages were smeared with dirt and rain, but I could still read some of the words. Scattered entries, not dated, but frantic. Something is out here. I keep hearing it. No way out. The last page just had one sentence scrawled in thick, desperate letters. It knows I see it. I dropped the notebook and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I ran in the direction I thought was back toward my car, crashing through the trees, branches cutting my arms. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Even when I swore I heard something running behind me. Took hours, maybe longer, but eventually I saw it. The dirt road where my car was parked. I stumbled onto it, gasping, drenched in sweat. My car was untouched, just sitting there like nothing had happened. I fumbled with my keys, got inside, and locked the doors. I sat there, hands gripping the wheel, trying to catch my breath. Then, just before I started the engine, I looked up, back toward the trailhead. And I swear, in the fading light, I saw movement. A shape, just at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't wait to see more. I started the car, slammed it into drive, and didn't stop until I was miles away. I never reported what I saw. What would I even say? I just know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out there, and whoever or whatever was watching me knew I saw it too. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sun was rising. The air was cool, and the sky was a pale blue, with streaks of orange cutting through the horizon. I had planned this trip for weeks, mapping out the trail, checking the weather, and making sure I had enough supplies. It wasn't a long hike, just a 2-day trip through a remote section of forest, but I wanted to be prepared. The area was known for its rough terrain and unpredictable weather. The trail started off easy. The first few miles were mostly flat, winding through tall pine trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Birds chirped somewhere above, and the distant rustling of leaves made the forest feel alive. I had a heavy pack on my back, filled with food, water, and a small tent. My boots crunched against the dirt path, and every step felt solid and reassuring. As I went deeper into the woods, the trail became narrower. The trees grew closer together, and the air smelled thick with pine and damp earth. I checked my map often, making sure I was on the right path. The plan was to reach a small clearing by late afternoon, set up camp, and continue the next morning. I had studied satellite images of the area, but nothing compared to being out here, surrounded by nature. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a fallen log, sat down, and pulled out a sandwich from my pack. As I chewed, I listened to the sounds around me. The forest was never truly quiet. Leaves rustled, birds flapped their wings, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint trickle of running water. That was a good sign. I knew there was a small stream nearby, and I had planned to refill my bottles there. After a short break, I kept moving. The terrain started changing. The ground became uneven, covered in exposed roots and loose rocks. I had to watch my step carefully. One wrong move and I could twist an ankle or worse. The deeper I went, the less maintained the trail became. It was clear that not many people came this way. Some parts of the path were overgrown with ferns, and fallen branches forced me to step off the trail briefly. The sun was starting to lower in the sky when I reached the clearing I had planned to camp at. It was a small, open space with a few scattered trees and a large, flat rock in the center. Perfect spot. I dropped my pack, stretched my arms, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresher here, and the temperature had dropped slightly. I wasted no time setting up my tent, using the last of the daylight to secure it properly. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry branches and started a small fire. As I sat by the fire, I ate another meal and stared into the flames. The woods around me were dark now. The only light came from the fire and the faint glow of the moon above. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a soft whisper that never really stopped. There were no other signs of life, no distant voices, no other campers. I was alone. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude. But there was something about being deep in the woods at night that made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, just a feeling, like the forest was watching. I tried to shake the thought and focused on the fire. After a while, my body started to feel heavy, the exhaustion of the day settling in. I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, double-checked that my tent was zipped up, and crawled inside my sleeping bag. The night was cold. Even inside my tent, I could feel the temperature drop. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and listened to the sounds outside. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees more violently. A few times I thought I heard something moving nearby, probably just an animal, maybe a deer. I told myself that over and over until, eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel sweat on my back despite the cold. I stayed still, listening. The wind was still there, rustling through the trees. But there was something else. A crunch. Not the sound of wind moving branches. Not the distant call of an animal. Something was stepping on the dry leaves outside my tent. Something heavy. I held my breath. Another step. Closer this time. I felt frozen. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. A bear? A mountain lion? But neither of those animals would move so cautiously. Predators either attack or they don't. This felt deliberate. The steps stopped. Silence. I waited, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, expecting to see a shadow, hear another step. But nothing came. The forest was still except for the wind. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, unmoving, listening to the darkness. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for hours. I unzipped my tent slowly and peeked outside. The forest looked the same, calm, peaceful. But when I stepped out, I noticed something. Footprints, not animal prints, human. They circled my tent, stopping just a few feet away. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. Someone had been out here with me. Someone had been watching me sleep. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't rest. I just moved. Every now and then, I checked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But there was no one. The whole way back, I felt like I was being followed. I never saw anything, never heard another step. But I felt it, that weight on my back, that pressure in my gut telling me I wasn't alone. I reached my car by the afternoon, threw my pack inside, and got in. When I locked the doors, I finally let out a long breath. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I drove away, I told myself I had imagined it, that the footprints could have been old, that the sounds could have been an animal. But deep down, I knew the truth. Someone had been out there with me, and they had waited until I fell asleep. I had planned this solo hiking trip for months. The goal was simple. 3 days, deep in the wilderness, no distractions. I chose a lesser-known trail in the Pacific Northwest, one I had read about on an old hiking forum. Not many people talked about it, and that was exactly what I wanted: solitude, nature, and the challenge of navigating a path that wasn't crowded with tourists. The drive out there took most of the morning. The last hour was spent on a narrow dirt road, the kind that made me grateful for my truck suspension. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was close to noon. My pack was heavy, but I had everything I needed: food, a water filter, extra clothes, a tent, a small first aid kit, and a knife strapped to my hip. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I also wasn't stupid. The first few miles were perfect. The path wound through dense pine forests, the air crisp and fresh. Sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams, and the only sounds were my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. It felt exactly like I had hoped: isolated, peaceful. After about 5 miles, the trail started getting rougher. The path narrowed, overgrown with roots and brambles, and I had to push through in places where nature was reclaiming the route. I checked my map frequently to stay on track. This wasn't a maintained trail, just an old route from logging days, barely marked. It wasn't even on official maps anymore, just a faint line on an outdated topographic one I had found online. By late afternoon, I set up camp near a small creek. The water was clear, cold, and perfect for filtering. I ate a simple dinner, watched the sun dip behind the trees, and enjoyed the stillness. That first night, everything was normal. I slept light, as I always did outdoors, but nothing disturbed me beyond the usual rustling of small animals. The second day was when things started feeling off. The trail got even harder to follow. At times, it completely disappeared, forcing me to rely on my map, compass, and gut instincts. The forest grew denser, the trees taller, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There was a weight in the air, something subtle but noticeable, like the pressure before a storm. The silence became unnatural. I realized I hadn't heard a single bird call or insect hum for hours, just the crunch of my boots and my own breathing. Then, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. A few feet off the trail, there was something hanging from a low branch. At first, I thought it was trash, some old fabric caught in the wind. But as I got closer, I saw it was a bundle of sticks, bound together with twine, a small bone tied at the center. It looked deliberate, ritualistic. My gut told me to keep moving. I picked up the pace. My plan was to reach a small clearing I had marked on my map, camp there, and then head back the next morning. I told myself the bundle was just some weird thing left by another hiker, maybe a joke, maybe something else. Either way, I wasn't superstitious. I pushed forward. An hour later, I found the second one. This one was hanging right in the middle of the trail. The same structure, sticks, twine, a small bone. But this time it was bigger, more intricate. And beneath it, on the dirt, was a single deep footprint. Not mine. Larger, barefoot. It was fresh. I stopped, listened. The forest was utterly silent. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. Someone was out here. Someone who didn't want to be found. I didn't run. Running in the wilderness is how you get lost or injured. Instead, I forced myself to walk steadily, heart hammering in my chest. I checked my knife, made sure it was secure. Every few minutes, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. I reached the clearing just as the sun dipped into the horizon. It was a wide, open space surrounded by thick pines. In the center, a massive, ancient tree stood alone, its bark weathered and twisted. It should have felt like a safe spot. Didn't. I set up my tent fast, every movement tight with tension. I built a fire larger than usual. The light helped, but my nerves didn't settle. I kept scanning the tree line, watching for movement. Every so often, I thought I saw something. A shift in the shadows, a flicker of motion, but it was never clear. I forced myself to eat, but my stomach was tight. I was being watched. I could feel it. That night, I barely slept. Sometime in the early hours, I woke to a noise, a low, rhythmic tapping. Not an animal, not the wind, something deliberate. I lay still, gripping my knife, every muscle frozen. The sound came from just outside my tent. Tap, tap, tap. Couldn't breathe. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. The trees stood still, but the feeling remained. Someone was there, just beyond the light's reach, watching. I didn't sleep again. I sat upright, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. The second the sun was up, I packed my gear and started hiking back, fast. The way back felt different. The silence was heavier. The forest felt like it was closing in. The stick bundles, more of them now, hung from the trees at random intervals, some fresh, some old. I moved quickly, not caring about the trail anymore, just heading in the direction of my truck. Then the worst moment. As I pushed through a thick patch of undergrowth, I saw movement ahead. Person, barefoot, thin, standing just between the trees. I couldn't see their face, just their shape. They didn't move. I turned and ran. I don't remember the last few miles. My body moved on autopilot, crashing through the brush, branches slashing at my arms. When I finally saw my truck, I felt like I might collapse. I threw my pack into the bed, jumped inside, and locked the doors before I even caught my breath. I didn't look back as I sped down that dirt road. When I got home, I went straight to my computer. I searched everything, old legends, missing hikers, anything. But that trail, it didn't exist. At least not officially. No records, no maps, nothing. I haven't been hiking since. I had always loved hiking alone. Something about being away from the noise, deep in the wilderness where it was just me, the trees, and the wind was calming. I liked the control. Choosing my own pace, stopping when I wanted, going as far as I felt like. So when I took a week off work, I planned a solo trip into the mountains. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It was an old logging road that had been abandoned years ago, now overgrown and rough. I had read about it in a forum where people shared off-the-beaten-path hiking spots. It was perfect, no tourists, no crowded viewpoints, just pure isolation. I started early in the morning, the air still crisp and cool. The first few miles were easy, just a steady incline through thick trees. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and the only real sound was my boots crunching on dirt. Felt good to be out there. No emails, no phone calls, no stress. A few hours in, I noticed the path getting narrower, less maintained. It was clear that few people had come this way in a long time. Bushes encroached on the trail, fallen logs blocked parts of it, and at times I had to push my way through branches. I wasn't worried, though. I had a GPS, extra food, and I knew how to handle myself. Around midday, I stopped to eat. I found a rock with a view overlooking a deep valley. It was beautiful, miles of green stretching into the distance. Nothing but wilderness. I felt lucky to be there, away from everything. But as I sat there, I realized something. It was too quiet. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind, which had been a constant presence all morning, had died down completely. There was nothing but silence. At first, I told myself it was normal. Animals go quiet sometimes. Maybe a predator was nearby, a bear or a cougar. I scanned the trees, my hand resting on the knife I kept on my belt, but I saw nothing. Still, the silence was unsettling. It made me feel exposed, like I was being watched. I finished eating quickly and got moving again, telling myself I was just overthinking it. But the further I hiked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trail, which had already been rough, was getting worse. Trees had fallen across it at odd angles, like something had forced them down. Some of them had deep scratches in the bark, long parallel lines, too clean to be natural. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing where I had planned to set up camp. It was a small, flat patch of land beside a creek, perfect for the night. But something was wrong. The ground was disturbed, fresh, deep marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged through. I crouched down, running my fingers over the impressions. They weren't tire tracks. They were too uneven, too irregular. And they were recent. The dirt was still loose. A part of me wanted to turn back, but I had hiked too far. It would be dark soon, and hiking back at night wasn't an option. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, and tried to ignore the unease gnawing at me. The night was worse. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. A slow, dragging sound. Something heavy. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see shadows moving beyond the thin fabric of my tent. Then it stopped. For what felt like forever, there was silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it, I heard a low, shuffling noise right outside my tent. I grabbed my knife, forcing myself to stay still. My heart was pounding. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I also didn't. I just sat there, knife in hand, listening. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The sounds faded into the distance. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking back. But something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. I had marked trees as I hiked up, small scratches with my knife to help me find my way back. But they were gone. Every single one. I tried to stay calm. I had a GPS. I followed it, but the further I went, the more the landscape didn't match what I remembered. Trees I didn't recognize, turns I didn't take on the way up. Then I found the first footprint. Not mine. Bigger, deeper. Someone or something had been following me. Panic started creeping in. I moved faster, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The woods felt wrong. The trees pressing in, the silence unbearable. Hours passed, but I wasn't making progress. My GPS was useless, pointing me in directions that didn't make sense. My water was running low. The sun was getting lower. Then I saw it, a shape in the trees. Not an animal, not a person, just a shadow too still, too tall. Watching, I didn't think. I ran. Branches whipped my face. My legs burned, but I kept going. I ran until my lungs felt like they would explode, until my legs threatened to give out. And then, somehow, I was back on a real trail. A wide one with clear markings, one I knew led back to the main road. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until I saw my car, until I was inside with the doors locked. I never reported it. What would I say? That something in the woods was watching me? That the trail changed? That I found footprints that weren't mine? No one would believe me, but I know what I felt, and I know I'll never go back there. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some places don't want you there, and I listened. I had been hiking alone for years. It was something I enjoyed, just me, the trees, and the open trail. No distractions, no noise, just nature. This time, I had planned a solo trip deep in the Montana wilderness. A 3-day trek, miles away from any town. The trail wasn't well known, which was exactly what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in the air. The path wound through dense trees, with the occasional clearing that revealed rolling hills stretching into the distance. I followed my map, marking my progress. My pack was heavy with supplies: water, food, a tent, a knife, and a first aid kit. Everything I needed. By evening, I found a good spot to set up camp. A small clearing beside a shallow stream. I pitched my tent, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal. The silence out here was comforting. No distant hum of cars, no voices. Just the occasional rustling in the bushes, likely rabbits or deer. As darkness settled, I climbed into my tent and zipped myself in. The night was quiet, except for the occasional chirping of crickets. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the hike. The second day started normal. I packed up my gear and continued down the trail. The forest thickened, the air cooler under the shade. Around midday, I came across something strange. A pile of rocks, stacked neatly in the middle of the path. At first, I thought it was just some hiker's way of marking the trail, but as I looked closer, I noticed that each rock was different in size and shape, carefully balanced. Something about it felt off. I took a photo, then carefully stepped around it and kept walking. After another hour, I saw another pile. This time, the rocks were stacked higher. I felt uneasy. Someone had placed these here, and I hadn't seen a single person since I started this hike. As the afternoon stretched on, I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. The trees felt taller, the spaces between them darker. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen. Nothing, just the wind. But my gut told me I wasn't alone. I hiked faster, putting more distance between myself and those strange rock piles. When the sun started setting, I found a spot to camp. I forced myself to eat, though my appetite was gone. The uneasiness clung to me like damp air. I built a fire, bigger than the night before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not animals, not the wind, just movement, subtle, shuffling, crunching. Every time I unzipped my tent and shone my flashlight, there was nothing. By dawn, I was exhausted. I wanted to keep going, finish my hike. But as I packed up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Another pile of rocks, right next to my tent. This one was smaller, but it hadn't been there the night before. Someone had been near me while I slept. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to enjoy the morning air. I just packed and started walking. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. I found more stacks of rocks, each one larger than the last. They weren't just on the path anymore. They were beside trees, near boulders, even balanced on fallen logs. Someone was doing this, and they wanted me to know they were there. Around midday, I reached a section of the trail that had a steep drop on one side. I moved carefully, my boots kicking small rocks over the edge. The sound of them bouncing down was swallowed by the trees below. That's when I saw it. A figure, far down the path, standing completely still. I stopped, my body frozen. It wasn't close enough for me to see details, but I knew it was a person. They were just standing there, blocking the trail. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My heart was hammering. My mind was screaming at me to turn back, but I had no other way. I had to go forward. I took a step. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. I kept walking, slowly, my hands tightening around the straps of my pack. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't looking at me. It was turned slightly away, head tilted down. They were wearing old, tattered clothes, dirty and torn. Bare feet, darkened with grime. Their hands were hanging limp at their sides. I took another step, then another. I was close now, maybe 30 feet away. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. I didn't want to speak. I didn't want them to turn. Then, in one quick motion, they moved. They didn't turn toward me. Instead, they stepped off the trail, just walked straight into the trees, vanishing into the thick brush like they had never been there. I stood there, my whole body rigid, my ears strained, listening. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. I ran. I ran so fast my pack bounced violently against my back. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The trail blurred past me. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I didn't think. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees. The end of the trail. My car. I nearly collapsed as I reached it. My hands fumbled for my keys, shaking so hard I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked every door, and sat there, gasping for air. I don't know who that was. I don't know why they were out there, but I do know one thing. When I glanced in my rearview mirror before driving off, there was a pile of rocks, right behind my car. I should have turned back when I had the chance. I had been planning this hike for months. The idea was simple. Drive out to a remote trail deep in the mountains, spend the weekend alone, clear my mind, and get away from everything. I wasn't new to hiking. I had done plenty of solo trips before, but this one was different. The trail I chose was not popular. I found it buried in an old forum post, mentioned by someone who had hiked it years ago. There were no recent reviews, no maps other than a vague, outdated topographical one, and only a handful of references online. That should have been my first warning. The drive itself took longer than expected. I followed an old, cracked road that wound up into the mountains. It was narrow, barely wide enough for my car, with deep drop-offs on one side and a dense forest pressing in on the other. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. There was no sign, no designated parking area, just a small clearing off the road. I pulled in, cut the engine, and stepped out. The air was cool and still. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I slung my pack over my shoulders, double-checked my gear, and started down the trail. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was narrow, cutting through thick undergrowth. It was overgrown in some spots, as if no one had been through in years. I had to push aside branches and duck under fallen trees. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs, the sound loud in the otherwise silent forest. I hadn't seen a single sign of human activity, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It was around dusk when I reached the spot where I had planned to camp. It was a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by towering pines. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. The heat was comforting, pushing back the creeping cold of the evening. I ate, stretched out beside the fire, and watched the stars appear overhead. Then I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, somewhere in the distance. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just the wind in the trees. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Still, I kept my headlamp on a little longer than usual before crawling into my tent. I woke up suddenly. I didn't know what time it was, but the fire had burned down to embers. The air was freezing, and then I heard it again, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind my tent. I held my breath. My first thought was a bear. I reached for my knife, keeping still, but something felt off. The steps weren't heavy enough for a bear. And they weren't the erratic movements of an animal. They were steady, slow, like someone walking carefully. I listened for what felt like forever, my heart hammering. Then silence. After a long time, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch falling. Maybe my imagination. I forced myself to lie back down, though it took a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, stretching. My breath hung in the cold air. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I checked around my campsite, looking for tracks. Nothing. But as I was packing up, I noticed something odd. A single boot print just at the edge of my camp. It wasn't mine. The print was older, partially covered by fallen leaves, but it was definitely there. And it wasn't an animal's. It looked like a hiking boot, maybe a size bigger than mine. I stared at it for a long time. It had been years since anyone had talked about this trail. Who else would be out here? I pushed the thought away and kept moving. The second day of hiking was tougher. The trail grew steeper, winding through rocky terrain. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged cliffs and uneven ground. My legs burned as I climbed, but I kept going. That afternoon, the feeling started. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything there. The unease grew stronger as the day wore on. The wind seemed quieter. The forest felt off, like something was watching me. By evening, I found another place to camp, an open plateau overlooking the valley below. The view was incredible, but I couldn't enjoy it. That sense of being watched was stronger now. I tried to ignore it as I set up my tent and started a fire. As darkness settled, I forced myself to eat. The silence was oppressive. Every small sound made my skin crawl. My brain kept playing tricks on me, making me think I saw movement at the edge of my vision. Then, as I was adding wood to the fire, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line, far enough that I couldn't make out details. But it was there. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a trick of the firelight? A tree? But no, it was a person, standing perfectly still. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the trees unmoving. I scanned back and forth, my hand shaking. Nothing. I told myself I was seeing things. The isolation was getting to me. I hadn't spoken to another person in 2 days. My mind was playing tricks, but I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I broke camp quickly. I wanted to get out. I wasn't enjoying this trip anymore. The trail back was supposed to be a loop, leading me back to my car by evening. I moved fast, pushing myself harder than usual. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. A campsite, abandoned, and not old. The tent was still there, collapsed. A fire pit with blackened wood. A backpack, half unzipped, spilling out clothes and supplies. A pair of boots, placed neatly beside the remnants of the tent. No sign of anyone. I called out, my voice breaking the eerie silence. Nothing. I checked the backpack. The food inside was expired but not rotten. There was no ID, no name, no indication of who it belonged to. But the thing that made my stomach drop was the notebook. It was lying near the tent, half covered in dirt. I picked it up and flipped through it, pages filled with frantic handwriting. Something is following me. I see it at night. It doesn't make noise. It knows I see it. The last entry was just 2 words, scrawled so hard into the paper that it nearly tore. Not alone. I dropped the notebook and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they would burst. The trail blurred past me. I don't remember much of the descent, only that the feeling of being watched never left me. I reached my car just as the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and tore down that narrow mountain road without looking back. I don't know who left that campsite. I don't know what happened to them, but I do know one thing. I was not alone out there. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me peace, a break from the noise of the world. This time, I planned a trip to a lesser-known trail deep in the mountains. It wasn't completely off-grid, but it wasn't popular either. A friend had mentioned it to me months ago, saying it was beautiful but tough. That was exactly what I wanted. The trail started off easy, a dirt path winding through thick trees, the sound of birds and rustling leaves filling the air. The air was crisp, the kind that feels fresh in your lungs. I had my backpack packed with everything I needed: food, water, a first aid kit, a knife, a small tent, and a map of the area. My plan was to hike up to a clearing near the ridge, set up camp for the night, then head back the next day. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. No distant chatter from other hikers, no signs of anyone else. It felt like I had the whole forest to myself. It was perfect. A few hours in, the path got steeper, and the trees grew denser. Sunlight barely reached the ground, making everything dim even though it was still daytime. I checked my map and compass often, making sure I was on track. Everything seemed fine. Around midday, I stopped to eat. Sitting on a fallen log, I pulled out a sandwich and enjoyed the silence. That's when I noticed something strange. A little further up the trail, off to the side, there was a clearing, but it didn't look natural. The trees were cut in a way that looked too deliberate, like someone had made space for something. The ground was covered in dead grass, and there were small rocks arranged in a pattern. I walked closer, feeling an unease I couldn't explain. The rocks were placed in rows, some forming small piles. It didn't look like a fire pit or a camp setup. It looked purposeful, like a marker or a warning. I shook it off and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge where I planned to camp. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills stretching far into the distance, the sky turning shades of orange and red. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back, enjoying the evening. The quiet was peaceful, but it was also heavy. As night fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. Something had pulled me from sleep, but I didn't know what. I listened. First, there was nothing, just the wind. But then, faintly, I heard it, a crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath. Could be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a fox. But the sound was steady, too slow, too careful. I stayed still, waiting. Then another sound, closer. This time, I knew it wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, human footsteps. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My heart pounded as I lay there, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Silence. Then, a slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the ground. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. The wind? No, it was too deliberate. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Finally, the sound faded. I waited even longer before I dared to move. When I finally unzipped the tent and looked out, there was nothing. The fire had burned down to embers, the forest still and dark. But something was off. My backpack was open. I knew I had zipped it. I always did. Nothing was missing, but someone had gone through it. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun started rising, I packed up and got moving. The way down felt different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling watched. The forest, which had felt peaceful before, now felt wrong. Then, about halfway down, I saw it. A shoe. Just one, lying in the dirt off the side of the trail. It was old, weathered, and next to it, barely visible under the leaves, was something worse. A ripped piece of fabric. I picked it up, stiff, torn at the edges, faded with time. I looked around. The trees felt taller, the silence heavier. I moved faster. By the time I reached the start of the trail, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I didn't stop until I got to my car, locked the doors, and sat there trying to calm my breathing. As I drove away, I thought about the shoe, the fabric, the strange clearing, and the footsteps outside my tent. Something had happened in those woods, and someone was still out there. I had been planning this solo hike for months, a 3-day trek through the backcountry, far from the tourist-heavy trails, deep in the wilderness. It was the kind of hike I loved most, isolated, challenging, and rewarding. The drive to the trailhead was long and uneventful. I parked my car in a dirt lot, checked my gear, and set off. The trail was rough, barely maintained, just as I expected. Thick pine trees lined the path, their scent filling the crisp morning air. The first few miles were easy, just a steady incline through a dense forest. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After a few hours, I reached a clearing with a small stream. I stopped for a break, refilled my water, and checked my map. Everything was going as planned. My goal was to reach a secluded ridge before nightfall, where I'd set up camp. There were no official campsites, just a flat area I had marked from satellite images. It would be quiet, undisturbed, perfect. As I continued, the trail became less defined. It was clear not many people hiked this way. I had to navigate using my map and GPS. I didn't mind, it was part of the adventure. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. That was the appeal. Around late afternoon, I noticed something odd. A single old boot sitting in the middle of the trail. It was weathered, cracked, as if it had been there for years. I glanced around but saw nothing else. No backpack, no sign of anyone. Just the boot. It was strange, but I pushed it out of my mind. People lost things all the time. I hiked on, reaching the ridge as the sun dipped low. The view was incredible. Rolling hills stretching for miles, untouched wilderness in every direction. I set up my tent, cooked a simple meal, and watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue. It was perfect. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, just the usual unease of being alone in the wild. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind, made my mind race. But I reminded myself, I'm the only person out here. There's nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I packed up and continued. My plan was to loop around and return by a different route. As I walked, I noticed a faint path branching off from my trail. It wasn't on my map, probably an old game trail. I felt curious, so I followed it for a bit. A mile in, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A campsite, but not a normal one. It was abandoned, scattered with torn gear, broken poles, and shredded fabric. A backpack lay half buried in the dirt, its contents spilling out. Clothes, a cooking pot, a knife. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no notes. Just this wreckage, as if someone had left in a hurry. Or worse, I felt uneasy. I scanned the area, listening. Nothing. It was dead silent. I considered turning back, but curiosity kept me there. I searched the ground, looking for clues. The gear was old, but not ancient, maybe a year, maybe less. It hadn't been taken by animals. Something else had happened here. Then I found the rope. A length of thick rope tied around a low-hanging tree branch. A noose. It swayed gently in the breeze. I stepped back, my pulse hammering. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite. Something terrible had happened here. I left, quickly. Back on my original path, I forced myself to stay calm. People did strange things in the wild. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone had been in distress, left in a hurry. But the noose, that was deliberate. That was something else. I hiked faster than before, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being alone, which I had once enjoyed, now felt suffocating. Then I heard it. A snap. Not a normal branch breaking. It was sharp, deliberate. I froze, listening. Silence. I waited, heart pounding. Then another snap. Closer. I wasn't alone. I didn't see anything, but I knew. Someone was there, watching. I moved fast, nearly running. My goal now was simple: get out of this place. The peaceful hike I had planned was over. Now it was survival. As I pushed forward, the trail became harder to follow. I knew I was going the right way, but something felt off. I should have reached a certain marker by now, a large boulder I had noted on the map. But it wasn't there. I checked my GPS, dead. My phone? Also dead. Panic crept in. I had full battery that morning. There was no reason for them both to die. The sound came again. Closer. This time, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. I didn't wait to see who it was. I ran. Branches whipped my face. Roots caught my feet. But I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. Then I saw it, the boulder. Finally, I was on the right path. Relief surged through me. I didn't stop moving until I reached the main trail, the one closer to civilization. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I never saw who it was. I never looked back. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my pack inside and drove without stopping, not even bothering to change out of my dirty clothes. When I got home, I checked the maps again. That path I had followed, it wasn't on any official records. That campsite, no reports, no missing persons that matched the gear I saw. It was like it had never existed. I haven't gone on a solo hike since. I always liked hiking alone. It was peaceful, a break from the noise of the city. No music, no traffic, just the sound of my boots crunching the dirt and the wind whispering through the trees. It was my way of resetting my mind, clearing out all the stress that built up during the week. I had been doing it for years, and I thought I knew what I was doing. But this hike was different. I had planned everything the way I always did. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, a remote one in the mountains. It wasn't too long, about 10 miles round trip, but it was steep. The reviews online said it was tough but rewarding, with some of the best views in the region. I packed my gear. Plenty of water, some snacks, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a headlamp. I even brought a small emergency bivy sack just in case. My phone was fully charged, but I knew I wouldn't have service. I didn't worry about that too much. I had hiked plenty of times without service. I got to the trailhead around 7 in the morning. My car was the only one in the parking lot. That should have been my first warning sign. Even on lesser-known trails, there's usually at least one other car. But I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just early. Maybe people didn't like hiking this trail because it was too hard. That thought actually made me feel good. I liked the idea of having the place to myself. The first few miles were fine. The incline was brutal, but I had expected that. The trees were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sounds were birds and the occasional rustling in the underbrush, probably squirrels or deer. It felt like a normal hike. Then I noticed something weird. I was about 3 miles in when I saw the first one. A tree, stripped of its bark about 6 feet up, deep scratch marks running down its trunk. I stopped and stared at it. I had seen claw marks on trees before. Bears do it all the time, but these looked different. They weren't spaced right for a bear. They were too long, too deep. I ran my fingers over them. The edges were fresh. Whatever made them had done it recently. I felt uneasy but kept going. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe some animal had a strange way of marking territory. Still, I picked up my pace a little. About a mile later, I saw something else. A deer, or what was left of one. It was off the trail, just past a small clearing. I could smell it before I saw it. The body was torn open, its insides spread out like something had been eating it. But the strange part was the way it was positioned. Its legs were bent at odd angles, like they had been broken before it died. There was no sign of struggle, no drag marks, no disturbed leaves. It was just there, like it had been placed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't normal. I turned back to the trail and kept moving. I wasn't gonna run. Running makes you look like prey, but I didn't stop to take in the scenery anymore. I just wanted to reach the summit, take a quick look, and head back down. That's when I realized something else. The forest was silent. I stopped walking and listened. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. My stomach twisted into a knot. I had been in the woods enough to know that when everything goes quiet, it means there's a predator nearby. I gripped my knife and forced myself to keep going. After what felt like forever, I made it to the summit. The view was incredible, miles of rolling mountains stretching out in every direction. But I barely looked at it. I just wanted to turn around and get out of there. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. Not hiking boots. Bare feet. And they weren't old. The dirt was still loose around the edges, like they had been made minutes ago. I felt something watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. I started walking back down, fast but not running. My body was screaming at me to run, but I knew better. Whatever was out there, I didn't want it to think I was weak. I gripped my knife tighter. The hike back felt different. The trees seemed closer, the air heavier. The silence pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. Every few minutes, I would glance over my shoulder, sure I would see something, but there was nothing. Then I saw the second deer. It was just like the first one. Torn open, legs broken, no signs of struggle. But this one was fresh. The blood was still wet, and it was right next to the trail. I forced myself to keep walking. My hands were shaking. I was sweating even though the air was cool. I just needed to get to my car. I wasn't even thinking about what I had seen anymore. I just needed to leave. Then, finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. My car was still there. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I stepped out of the tree line, walked straight to my car, and got inside, locking the doors. That's when I saw the footprints again, right next to my car. Bare feet, leading up to the driver's side door. My stomach turned to ice. Someone had been here. Someone had been waiting. I turned the key so fast I nearly broke it. The engine roared to life and I threw it into reverse. Gravel sprayed as I backed out. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. My heart was pounding. My mind was racing. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I'm never hiking alone again. I had been planning the hike for weeks, a solo trip through the mountains, away from the noise of the city, away from people. Just me, the forest, and the trail. I picked a route that was remote but not completely isolated, one of those lesser-known trails that had some online reviews but weren't exactly tourist hotspots. I wanted solitude, not danger. I left early in the morning, the sun just beginning to light up the sky as I parked my truck at the trailhead. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. I checked my gear, extra food, plenty of water, a first aid kit, a knife, and a map with a compass. I had my phone, but I knew better than to rely on it. Signal would be spotty at best, non-existent at worst. I had told my brother my route and estimated return time. Safety first. The first few miles were easy. Well-worn paths, gradual inclines, the kind of hike that makes you feel alive without making you struggle. Birds chirped in the trees, and I even spotted a few deer in the distance. It was perfect. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path continued west, but a narrower, less trodden path veered north. I had read about this path in an old forum post. Someone had mentioned that it led to a hidden valley with stunning views, but also that it was easy to get lost if you weren't careful. I had my compass, my map, and daylight on my side. I decided to go for it. The trail was rougher than I expected, overgrown in places, roots sticking out, rocks loose underfoot. It was clear that not many people took this path. I moved carefully, checking my position on the map every so often. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded. It wasn't silent, but it felt off, like something was just out of place. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a single marker or footprint. The trail was supposed to loop back towards the main path eventually, but I wasn't seeing any sign of that happening. I pulled out my map again, but the landmarks around me didn't match what I expected. That gnawing feeling of unease started to creep in. I decided to backtrack. If I followed my own footprints, I'd get back to the main trail. Simple enough. But as I turned, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There were no footprints. The soft dirt should have held my tracks, but the path behind me looked untouched. I knew I had come this way. I had stepped through mud not 10 minutes ago. There should have been some sign of me passing, but there was nothing. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe the ground had dried faster than I thought. Maybe the wind had scattered the prints. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping an eye on the trees, looking for anything familiar. but nothing was familiar anymore. The trees looked the same in every direction. The path twisted in ways I didn't remember. I wasn't just lost, I was completely turned around. My compass still pointed north, but it was like the trail itself had shifted while I wasn't looking. I walked for another hour, maybe two, hoping to find something, anything, that I recognized. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I knew I had to make a decision. I could keep moving and risk getting even more lost in the dark, or I could set up camp and wait until morning when I'd have better visibility. My gut told me to stop, so I did. I found a relatively flat area near a fallen tree and set up my small tent. I built a fire, ate one of my protein bars, and tried to focus on a plan. If I followed the sun's direction in the morning, I should be able to head west and intersect with the main trail. I just had to make it through the night. The forest was unnervingly quiet as darkness settled in. I had camped alone before, but this felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was just beyond the firelight, watching. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was being paranoid. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance, a rhythmic, deliberate noise, footsteps. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The footsteps were slow, steady. Not an animal too heavy, not another hiker too deliberate. I reached for my knife and held it tight. Then they stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, staring into the dark. Nothing moved. The fire flickered, casting shadows against the trees. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the wind, but I knew better. Something or someone was out there. I barely slept. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time packing up. I needed to get out of there. I moved fast, ignoring my exhaustion, pushing forward. But no matter which way I went, nothing looked right. I started marking trees with my knife, making sure I wasn't going in circles. Hours passed. My water supply was running low. My legs ached. Then I saw something ahead. A structure. Not a cabin. Not a ranger station. Just a shack. Old, rotting, barely standing. Shouldn't have been there. No maps mentioned a structure out here. But at that moment, it was the only sign of anything human. I approached cautiously. The door hung open slightly. The inside was dark. It smelled like damp wood and decay. I stepped in. Inside, the walls were covered in deep scratches. Some looked old, others fresh. The floor was littered with broken glass, bones, small ones like from rabbits or birds. A backpack sat in the corner, torn open, its contents scattered. I checked the tag. It wasn't mine. Then I noticed the writing, faint, scrawled into the wood near the door. Leave before night. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, not caring about direction anymore. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned. I ran until I stumbled onto something familiar, the main trail. I don't know how I found it, and I don't care. I followed it without stopping, pushing forward until I reached the parking lot. My truck was there, just as I had left it. I threw my gear inside and drove away without looking back. I never found out who wrote that message, or what made those scratches. But I know one thing, I was not alone in those woods, and whatever else was out there, it wanted me to stay. The wind carried the scent of pine through the air as I adjusted the straps on my backpack. It was early morning, the kind where the sun barely kisses the tops of the trees, stretching long shadows over the dirt path. My plan was simple: hike up to the ridge, camp for the night, and head back down the next day. A solo trip to clear my mind. I had picked this trail because it was remote, not completely uncharted, but far enough from popular routes that I didn't expect to see anyone else. That was part of the appeal. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The first few miles were easy, a gentle incline through thick woods. I kept a steady pace, listening to the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustle of unseen animals in the underbrush. The trees stood tall, packed tightly together, their trunks rough with age. Some had deep grooves from where bears or other animals had scratched at the bark. I had seen plenty of signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, droppings off the path, but nothing out of the ordinary. The first sign that something felt wrong came around midday. The forest had been alive with birdsong earlier, but now it was silent. Not a single chirp. I stopped, listening, trying to figure out what had changed. My skin prickled. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnaturally quiet. I shook it off and kept moving. Maybe a predator was nearby, and the smaller animals were staying hidden. That made sense. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, standing between the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty trail winding behind me. A few miles later, I found a good clearing to set up camp. It was a flat area near a small stream, perfect for an overnight stay. I dropped my pack and stretched my arms, rolling the stiffness out of my shoulders. As I worked, that feeling of being watched never went away. Clung to me, heavy and suffocating. I set up my tent quickly, trying to focus on something tangible. The sun was setting by the time I had everything ready. I built a small fire and sat close to it, eating a simple meal. My body was tired, but my mind was alert, ears tuned to every noise in the dark. The fire crackled, sending flickering shadows across the trees. I told myself that I was just on edge from hiking alone. That's all it was. Then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a sharp snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze. My breath hitched. It was close. I slowly turned my head, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved, but I knew what I heard. I wasn't alone out here. I stood up, my body tense. Probably an animal, I muttered to myself, barely a whisper, but I didn't believe it. The sound was deliberate, careful. I reached into my bag and pulled out my flashlight. A beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the trees in front of me. Nothing. I swung it to the left, then the right. Still nothing. But just as I lowered it, I caught something in my peripheral vision movement. A flicker of motion behind the trees. I snapped the light back up, but whatever it was had vanished. My heart pounded. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here. If someone or something was watching me, they had been careful to stay hidden. I didn't like that. I made the decision then. I wasn't going to stay the night. It wasn't worth it. My gut screamed at me to get out of there. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to make sure everything was secured. My hands were shaking as I stamped out the fire, plunging the campsite into near total darkness. I flicked my flashlight back on and started moving. Fast. The trail was harder to follow in the dark, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep going. Every few steps, I glanced back, expecting to see something following me. The trees felt closer, the air colder. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Then up ahead, I saw it. A shape standing in the middle of the trail. Not an animal, not some shadow trick of the trees. Person. I stopped dead in my tracks. The flashlight beam wavered in my grip as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. They weren't moving, just standing there completely still. I took a step back, my entire body screaming at me to run. But before I could react, the figure took a slow step forward. Then another. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches whipped against my face. Roots snagged at my boots, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually, I saw something ahead. My car. I had made it back to the trailhead. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't slow down. I fumbled with my keys, throwing myself inside and locking the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine, headlights cutting through the dark. I expected to see the figure at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing, just an empty trail leading into the woods. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, tearing down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away. I still don't know who or what was out there. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never hike alone again. I had planned the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: 3 days alone in the mountains, a break from the world, no distractions, no people, just me and nature. I wanted to test myself, get away from my phone, clear my mind. I had done a few solo hikes before, but nothing like this. This was deeper, more remote. The kind of place where if something went wrong, no one was coming to help. That was part of the appeal. The trail I picked wasn't anything extreme, but it was out there. It was an old logging road that turned into a narrow path through thick forest, leading up to a ridge that overlooked a deep valley. The place was rarely visited. It was marked on maps, but you wouldn't find much about it online. No Instagram spots, no trip reports, just a name and a line on a topographic map. I started early. The first few miles were easy: worn dirt, scattered rocks, the occasional fallen tree. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of the forest were there: birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant creak of trees swaying in the wind. It was peaceful, but after a few hours, something started to feel off. It wasn't something obvious. It was just a feeling at first, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was in my head, that I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. But I couldn't shake it. The deeper I went, the stronger it got. Every so often, I'd stop and listen. Nothing, just my own breathing. By midday, I reached the base of the ridge. That's when I noticed the first strange thing: the silence. The wind had stopped. The birds had stopped. Even the trees, which had been swaying gently all morning, were still. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the elevation, the way the trees blocked the wind. But I couldn't ignore the unease crawling up my spine. I pressed on. The climb was rough, steep in places, but manageable. I took my time, keeping my eyes on the ground, focusing on each step. When I finally reached the top, I felt a small sense of relief. The view was incredible. A sea of green stretching out for miles, broken only by the occasional peak. I took off my pack, sat down, drank some water. For the first time in hours, I started to relax. That's when I saw it. On the far side of the ridge, maybe 200 feet away, was a clearing. In the middle of it stood a cabin. I hadn't seen it on the map. It looked old, weathered, like it had been abandoned for decades. The roof sagged, the walls were dark with rot, the windows empty. But there was something else, something that made my stomach tighten. The door was open, just a few inches, like someone had left in a hurry. I told myself I wasn't going to check it out. I wasn't stupid, but as I sat there, staring at it, I couldn't look away. There were no roads leading to it, no trails. Shouldn't have been there. I got up. Slowly, I made my way across the clearing. Every step felt wrong, like I was crossing some invisible line I wasn't supposed to. When I reached the porch, I hesitated. The wood was splintered, warped. It groaned under my weight as I stepped forward. Inside, it was worse. The air was thick, stale. The floor was covered in dirt, leaves, animal droppings. But it wasn't just old. It looked like someone had been there recently. There were footprints in the dust, some fresher than others. A broken lantern sat on a table, next to a stack of papers, their edges curled and yellowed with age. A rusty stove stood in the corner, its door hanging open. Then I saw the bed. It was the only piece of furniture that looked untouched. The blankets were pulled up neatly, the pillow fluffed. But the worst part was the smell. It wasn't rot, or mildew, or anything you'd expect in an abandoned place. It was something else. Something sour, metallic. Blood. It was faint, but it was there. My stomach turned. I stepped back, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I turned, I noticed something else. The footprints. They weren't mine. They led from the door to the bed. And then they stopped. No other tracks. No sign of someone leaving. Just a single trail leading in. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran. Out of the cabin, across the clearing, back to the ridge. My legs were shaking as I grabbed my pack. I didn't care about resting anymore. I just wanted to get down, get away. The hike back was a blur. The feeling of being watched was worse now, stronger. Every shadow felt like it was moving. Every sound made me flinch. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just kept going. I reached my car just as the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anything was there. I never found out who had been in that cabin. I never looked it up, never tried to find it again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footprints, about the bed, about the way the door had been left just barely open, like someone was waiting for me to come inside.